fine.
Okay.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. So on this example, what we have are just some of the columns that I typically like to use. So one of these columns is the internal due date, which I think is so important because sometimes we'll have a funder due date, or, you know, let's say we're doing an Earth Day campaign and we know that Earth Day is April 22nd. I believe. Don't quote me on that. It might be. And then we want to make sure that we have things prepped before April 22nd, so we're not scrambling that day to put everything together. I love having that internal due date. And then the due date, if that's a specific funder due date, you know, maybe it's a grant that has a rolling deadline, which means that they don't have a specific deadline. They accept applications all year round. I really like to put that so I know, oh, if I need to move this up or back, then I can adjust that. The funder, in that column, if there's a specific foundation or corporation, or if we're thinking major donors, I don't like to get too specific. You know, if we've got our top 10 major donors, I don't necessarily like to put their names on this fundraising calendar because I find that that can be a little bit too detailed. But what I do like to put is like major donor campaign, or, you know, if this is for, some of you had mentioned like a smaller donor campaign, then it would be that. Contact information, if there's contact information, amount of requests, or this might be the goal that we're trying to raise. So if we've got a Giving Tuesday campaign, which I want to just jump in and mention, if y'all haven't seen the Giving Tuesday, you know, worldwide, or maybe it's national or international, that has moved up to May 5th. And I think there's going to be another one later this year, but they are doing like this hashtag Giving Tuesday now. So just something to consider. Anyways, then the request, what we're actually asking for the money. So if we are just doing, you know, a general campaign for general funds, that's one thing. If we're doing a campaign for a specific program, or grant ask for a specific program, I like to put that in. Responsible parties. This is an important column because, again, it shouldn't just be one person fundraising, but you need to really spell out who is going to be doing what, and having it in a place, in a shared document where we can all see that really helps increase that accountability. And sometimes I like to be more detailed or less detailed in this column. So for example, on this ABC Foundation, this first row, you know, I would put like Greg draft the application, Julie review, Susan submit, or something like that. If that's who was going to do all of the pieces, you might want to get more detailed. You might not need to be more detailed. Next steps, notes, date submitted, outcome, and how much funding was actually raised. So that's just an example, which I like to use, and it really depends on what you're going to use the fundraising calendar for, and we will get to that in just a second. So Nick, if you will go to slide 9, that's the template I just put in the chat. So before putting your fundraising calendar together, before even thinking about what you're going to use your fundraising calendar for, what I really encourage you to do is figure out what your organization needs. What do you need funding for? What is important? So typically, goodness, there's so many thoughts going in my head. give them a second to settle. So a lot of times we like to think of our funding in just like a big pot. And we think, you know, we just need money for our organization. We just need money for our organization. But when we break it down and say, okay, this program, we need this much money. And then if we could break it down even further and be like, okay, in this specific program, we need this much money for materials, we need this much money for staff, we need this much money for this. Having it all broken down really helps us be able to pivot what we're asking funding for from who, and how we can really make sure all of those little holes are filled in. So for example, we love general operating funding from grantors, right? But that's not the maybe most common, or that's not always available type of funding. So a lot of times it's program or project funding. So if we are able to specifically say we need this much money for this thing, then we can use other funding we get from maybe major donors or our online campaign that we were doing, our Colorado Gives Day, and fill in around that big grant that we got for our program. So by identifying what we actually need is really helpful. And then on top of your needs, creating your fundraising goals. So that is a totally separate thing. We don't have all that much time to get into it today, but I really like to encourage nonprofits to create 2 different budgets for internal purposes. One budget of like, here's what we need, and then one budget of like, here's what we could do with even more money, or here's what we need plus the reserves we're trying to build for next year. So really identifying the difference between what we need and what our goals are, because if we are just fundraising for what we need and we fall short, then we're not going to have enough money to cover everything. But if we fundraise for more than we need, if we have goals above just our basic needs and we fall short of that, we still might get what we need, or we might even get more than we need and be able to build up those reserves or start saving for a new program or hire that new staff member that we wanted but didn't feel like it was a true need. So what are your needs? What are your goals? And then what strategies have worked for you in the past? We want to build on those successes. So really understanding this was a great campaign. Maybe we should do it again this year. At least, give yourself, in those quizzes, they have sometimes the fill in the blanks, but they've got that box at the top, the word bank. Give yourself a word bank of strategies that you have used that have worked in the past, that you can fill into your fundraising calendar, and really understanding, okay, what strategies from this little word bank are we going to use? Do we say, okay, we're going to try and make these, and these happen? And that might be things that you haven't tried before. So it's not necessarily just what has worked, but what has worked and what are you going to try again? Once you have this information, you will be more prepared to start building a fundraising calendar that actually works. And I feel like I'm talking super fast. If y'all have questions, please type them into the chat box, and I would be happy to answer them throughout. So Nick, if you'll go to the next slide, slide 10. Thank you. So once you have that information, you can use a fundraising calendar in several different ways. One way is to strategically time out the planning of your different fundraising activities. You can also use it to track fundraising activities and asks, track those fundraising outcomes, and communicate fundraising progress with the team. It's really up to you what your priority is and how you're wanting to use this. If this is going to be a shared document with your team that you're all going to work off of, if this is going to be, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, a shared document that everyone else only has view-only access to, and you're the only one that can edit it to put in those updates. But how are you going to use this for your organization? Like, what's a priority for you? Maybe you track your fundraising outcomes in Salesforce, so that's not as important for you on this particular document. Maybe it's nice to have it in both places. It's really what works best for your organization. And if you'll go to the next slide, Nick, slide 11. Thank you. So when you're figuring out, okay, what's our priority? What are we going to do? We can also think about what we're going to put into our fundraising calendar. So are we going to use this with grants, corporate donors, individual donors, events, giving days, reporting, campaigns, donor appreciation? And I just want to mention, if you are feeling really stressed because we're going so fast and you're trying to take a ton of notes, please feel free to just take some screenshots of some of this. And also know the recording will be available for at least 4 weeks, maybe. I don't know, Nick, but the recording of this will also be available. So you might also want to incorporate your donor appreciation into your fundraising calendar, just as a reminder even. So it's anything that your team needs to track. So maybe you have a individual donor CRM system that's working really well for your organization, and you don't want to necessarily put that information onto this fundraising calendar. Yes, the calendar template is on this link right here. If you just want to go there, you can download it. It says free fundraising calendar template. So, and you'll have this template. But, you know, maybe for individual donors, you have that in a different system and that works really well for your organization. I would say keep doing what's working well for your organization and use this to add in things. So, for example, one of your fundraising goals might be our development director sits down with 10 major donors a month, and 5 of those major donors we do asks of. And you have, sorry, Salesforce is just the one coming to mind, but you know, think of whatever CRM system you might have. You know, you have in Salesforce that the different donors, the different opportunities opened up, and you're tracking and it's automatically emailing you reminders and things like that. If that's working for you, great. Then maybe you don't need to put on every month, you know, sit down with 10 donors, sit down with 10 donors and make 5 asks. And you don't necessarily need to put their names in there either. But if that's something new to your organization and you want to increase accountability amongst your team for that, then it might be helpful to include that reminder and just say, okay, what were the outcomes for this particular month? What are the next steps? And making sure your team is all on the same page about that, that might be helpful for you. So there's a lot of ways that you could use this, and I'm not here to tell you how you should use this, but really think through creatively what's going to be helpful for me and my team. What's going to make sure that we're all on the same page and that nothing gets dropped off. So another example, if donor appreciation is something you feel like your organization is really not doing well enough, putting that into your fundraising calendar could help you remember it better and be more active in that donor appreciation. So lots of options. Will you go to the next slide, Nick? Slide 12, thanks. Parts of a fundraising calendar, we went over this a little bit, but it's really up to you. Maybe some due dates, some funding opportunity and related information, what you will ask for. I really like to put specific amounts, even when it comes to grants, because it's like we asked for $50,000 and they gave us $30,000. And I have both of those numbers to easily see. And next year I can decide, okay, we asked for 50, they gave us 30. Do we want to ask for 50 again? Do we want to ask for 30 or 45? Do we want to ask for 60 and think they'll give us, 40? And you just have that information to easily see. And so I really like to have the specific amount we ask for. Whether it's an ask or a campaign, we tried to raise $20,000, but we raised 25, or we only raised 10, that kind of stuff. Next steps. The date requested or the date the campaign was completed or initiated. This kind of stuff really helps, because if we were planning to do, that Earth Day campaign, but we weren't able to get stuff out until the day after Earth Day, then internally we might not think, we might be able to see, oh, it's not necessarily the Earth Day campaign that was the problem. We just weren't on top of it enough. Like we weren't quick about it enough. So there was something broken within our organization, not necessarily broken with that particular fundraising strategy. So that's why I really like to keep track of those dates to understand if we're really meeting those internal deadlines that we're setting for ourselves. Notes, outcome and follow-up. So again, if the follow-up is a report that's due in November and you put report due in November and then go to November and put the report, that could potentially be helpful. So Nick, will you go to the next slide? Awesome, thank you. So take just a second, think about what the purpose of your fundraising calendar will be, what information you will include, and if there's anything you can, maybe not start filling it in now just because we don't have the 3 hours, we just have an hour and a half, but I would love to hear in the chat box, what you're thinking of using your calendar for. And again, we're not fully creating this, so we might have other team members with other ideas coming in later. So this isn't going to be the final thoughts on your fundraising calendar, but I would love to hear your initial thoughts about what you're going to use your fundraising calendar for. So if you could just type those in the chat, or if anyone wants to, you know, speak, I'm happy to listen. Okay. Emily says, seeing where the gaps in appeals are and brainstorming ways to fill them. I would love to hear more about that. Do you mean like we do an appeal here and we do an appeal here, but then we don't get any money coming in during this time? Is that what you're talking about? Yes. Okay, great. Yes. So seeing the timing of everything. Thanks, Emily. All right, I'll give it just another few seconds in case someone's typing, just to hear what you're thinking of putting in your fundraising calendar. Okay, for our fundraising challenge that we would like to kick off in May. Yes, I would love to hear more about this fundraising challenge, maybe a little bit later, Cheryl, because I'm really interested in what you mean by that. I think a lot of us use different terms to mean the same thing, so I would love to hear more about that. Okay, will you go to the next slide, Nick? Thank you. I really appreciate you doing this for me. So filling in your fundraising calendar. I really like to start with the things that have hard deadlines. So if you know you have your specific event on this date, or you know a grant that you're going after is due on this date, fill in all of those things first. And then, you know, look and see if you need to rearrange some of those deadlines to complete things earlier. So, you know, the hard deadlines, those funder deadlines or the other deadlines are going to stay the same, but you can move things around to submit things earlier if it's a grant, or to prepare everything for your fundraising event earlier so that you can focus on these other things the month of. So hard deadlines first, and then really look and see where you can plug in the things that have more flexible deadlines. So you're thinking of maybe doing a new fundraising event, you know, looking at your calendar and saying, okay, we've got a lot of, you know, asks going out and potential money coming in the fall, but we don't really have stuff in the spring. Right now, even, this would be a good time to rearrange your fundraising calendar. If you had a specific event that you were expecting to raise a certain amount of money for or from, and that has been canceled or postponed to next year, or maybe postponed into the fall, looking at where are we making asks, where is our effort going? So if we're super busy, we won't be able to finish those extra, you know, 3 grant deadlines. Effort, where your effort's going, but then also when the money might be coming in. So for some fundraising calendars, people like to put on like money expected by and then a date so that they can sort it by that date sometimes, and then see, okay, if we don't have any money coming in at this point in the year and we are not raising enough money to cover us through that point of the year ahead of time, then really switching things up and seeing how you can move things around. So I feel like that's clear, but I'm just like saying it a bunch. So if that's really confusing, please let me know and I can try to reword that. Hard deadlines, rearrange, flexible deadlines, and then identify, and of course, you've already plugged in things, so if you needed to rearrange more, you could, but identify whether you'll need additional support and how you're gonna get it. So if you're like, wow, August is just packed for us, and because June and July are also really tense, we don't have enough, you know, staff power to really complete all of the activities we need. Okay, so what do we need to do? Are we hiring a part-time person during that time? Are we getting some consultant support? Are we prepping things 4 months in advance to really be ahead of our busy season? That's one thing to look out for. But then the other thing is, oh, we don't have enough going on we need more ideas, or we need to find more grant opportunities, or we need support putting together a crowdfunding campaign or things like that. Identifying how you are going to get that support. Is this something, are you going to rely on your board members to come and plug in and be extra on their fundraising game during this period where things are slower? Or are you going to, again, get consultant support? Or are you going to hire a part-time person or have your intern work on that kind of stuff? So really seeing, are we going to make it? Is this good? And will this actually help us reach our goals? So by having some of those columns, like how much we're asking for, you can total that up and see, oh, we're not even asking for enough money throughout this whole year, or because we don't expect to get every single dollar that we ask for. So we need to be asking for more and finding those additional opportunities. So there's a lot of ways you can really use this like map, even though it's a spreadsheet, like kind of like map and understand each component and how it's working for your organization or how it won't work for your organization. We go to the next slide, Nick. Thank you. So when you're like creating that fundraising calendar, really double checking to say, okay, are we making asks for all of our fundraising needs? Is there something that we identified that we needed when we started this process that we aren't going to be able to cover? So for example, maybe we're so focused on grants, which I just want to mention should only be a small portion of your overall fundraising picture. But maybe our organization really relies heavily on grants, and we've got a grant for this program and a grant for this program and a grant for this program, but we're not doing enough individual donor cultivation. So we're not going to be able to cover rent, or we're not going to be able to cover this administrative staff person because they don't fit in with these program grants that we're going after. Making sure we're really asking for all of our fundraising needs. And then do the request amounts total more than our actual fundraising needs? Because that's really important. You're not going to get 100% of the dollars that you ask for. So you need to plan to ask for a lot more than you actually need. That's why you have those goals. And then even beyond those goals, asking for more than those particular goals, because you're not expecting to get all of that money. Are there any fundraising activities left out? Maybe we forgot to put our major event on the fundraising calendar, and now we need to go in and put that in and adjust it. Or at this point, maybe our events are getting pushed back into the fall. And so we need to make some adjustments around what we're doing in the fall to accommodate for those events and to make sure we're not asking our people for money in both, October, November, and then, oh, hey, Colorado Gives Day in December, and we don't have any cultivation activities in between those. So we can't just like ask. We've really got to focus on timing it to where we're not constantly asking for money. We're really providing other kinds of updates and other kinds of information and appreciation. Do we have the capacity to make all of these requests? We went over that a little bit. And then do we need to find additional opportunities to put into this calendar? These are great questions for you to ask your team and to make sure you really feel good about the plan that you implement later on in the year. So I'm going to take a pause for just a second. Do we have any questions? How are we feeling about this information? Is this making sense? Do I need to go over something? Next, we're going to be talking about how to get our team involved, and I'm going to be asking for some ideas around that. But if you have any questions or want to jump in with an example to talk about, I'd be happy to do that. Okay, seems very straightforward and clear to Casey. I'll give it another little bit just to see if anyone else has questions. I know we're going just so fast. Okay, awesome. So now we talk about, you mentioned how funds can be restricted for programs, unable to be used for rent, etc. What are some What are clear ways to track that in the calendar / which budgets are running out when? This is always hard for me to wrap my mind around. Yes, that is a great question. So when you have this column, and I forget what slide it is, but Nick, do you mind going back up? I think it might be slide 7. Slide 7. If you have this column with the specific request, then that will help you understand, okay, we've asked for this program, we've asked for this particular need, we've asked for this. If you want to, if you're focused on the cash flows and that's a major concern for your organization, I would also include on this fundraising calendar a funds expected by date, and then see. So let's just take a summer camp as an example, because it's kind of easier to picture. You've got a summer camp and you need the money before the summer starts or during the summer to keep that summer camp going. But one of the grants that would be a perfect fit, you are asking for, like, their deadline is in the fall and they're not going to make any decisions and you wouldn't get that money till January. Really thinking about, okay, we have to ask for the following year because January we're going to get the money and we'll be able to spend that before that summer, and making sure you understand that if you ask for it this year, that like you won't get the money in time for this summer's program. So really understanding when we expect to get the funding by, and therefore when we are trying to, like, what we are trying to ask for, summer 2021, to make sure you have that money in hand before you need it. So for your organization, when you're outlining, here's our budget and here's, our goal, kind of our goal budget, our expanded budget, or our fundraising goals to support our budget, identifying when you need some of that money by, because you might have bigger purchases at a certain time of the year. And so understanding, okay, we need to have all of that money saved up by this date. So we need to push some of our campaigns to earlier in the year or shift things around in that way. So the calendar won't necessarily tell you when your budgets are running out, but it's the planning process of putting things into the calendar that will help you make sure that's not happening. So if you do have a big unexpected expense or a time like this where your cash flows are maybe way different than you anticipated, it's taking a pause and taking a step back and really redoing that and saying, okay, here was our original budget. Here's what our budget looks like now. We're not doing programs, so we're saving some of that money, or we're doubling up on programs, so we're spending double the money. We're still trying to pay staff, but we weren't doing our fundraising event. And so really identifying, okay, here's how much money we need when, and because now in particular, we are having a different time. Oh goodness, I just have so many things to say about this. Sorry. Because now we're in a different time, we might need some general operating funding versus program funding in a different way. So the funds that are restricted for programs are typically primarily from grants or from a donor that specifically says, hey, I want this money to go to this. And if some of that money is too restricted for you, you can turn it down. An example that I've used before is an organization that was going to get $1 million for a new building, but the donor said it has to be a building in this neighborhood, and they turned that money down because they didn't want to build a building in that neighborhood or find a building in that neighborhood. They were trying to keep their search broad. Anyways, that's maybe a little sidetracked, but because of COVID right now, the grant opportunities are primarily general operating funding. So if you're looking for that right now, that could be a great way to fill in some of these holes that you're experiencing. If you have follow-up questions about that, Yazan, oh, sorry, I'm so bad at names. Okay, Eva says, our organization consists of only 2 people, myself focused on day-to-day work and my colleague who focuses on legislative work. Adding this seems very overwhelming. Okay, that is a great note. Do you have a board, Eva? A board of directors? I'm guessing yes. If you're a 501c3, then yes. It doesn't have to just be the 2 of you. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Who needs to be involved in this fundraising planning and calendar? and who needs to be implementing things. But if you lay everything out and you realize, oh, this is too much work for the two of us, then you can either be taking pieces out if you don't need to raise as much money, or saying to board members, hey, you have a fiscal sponsor and no board. Okay, I thought you would have to have a board even to have a fiscal sponsor, like even just I guess I'm confused on that, like not necessarily a board of directors, but like a supportive board or an advisory board. Then we'll talk about your situation in particular in just a minute when we get to the teamwork stuff. A steering committee. Yes, the steering committee. They can also be helpful. Let me take a pause on that, and then as you have more questions about that, we'll get to that when we talk about the team. Cheryl says, do you generally use the calendar as an annual calendar for multiple activities/events, or could the calendar be useful for just one activity or event? This particular calendar, it seems though it is as though it is designed for more than one activity. Yes, I encourage people to lay out on whatever they have. Maybe it's not this spreadsheet. Maybe they have a big board in their office where they just like say, here's when our different campaigns and our fundraising events and our grants are happening. So you can absolutely use this fundraising calendar for just one thing. The most common thing I see this calendar used for is grants, because those are you need to track those a little bit differently than some of your other things. So if you want to use it for just one activity and that works for your organization, that's great. I'm hoping though, in the process of developing this fundraising calendar for just that one thing, you also understand, okay, here's when we're gonna do these other fundraising activities, and making sure that doesn't clash. So that's really the point, is to make sure you are not overloaded in one month and then set yourself up for failure because you don't have enough staff power to have 3 grants submitted and have your event and do an online crowdfunding campaign all at the same time. So it's really what works for your organization, and just making sure nothing is overloaded. Okay, great. Let's go back down to, let me see. I think this is slide 16. Nick, if you don't mind going there. Great, thank you. Who needs to be involved in this fundraising calendar development? Because really we're using this as a fundraising planning tool, not just like putting things in your Google Calendar as reminders, you know. Your leadership of your organization. So that might include your board for your organization if you have a really small team. That might include your steering committee if you have a really small team. Whoever might be in leadership needs to be supportive, at least through like giving approvals, or at least through saying, that looks good, let me know how I can help. The fundraising staff, if you have fundraising staff, of course need to be involved. But people that we often forget to involve in this kind of stuff are our financial staff. They're going to have that information about the cash flows for us. They're going to have that information about when we need particular funds by, or if we're running out. If you don't have financial staff and you're the financial staff, making sure you're consulting your QuickBooks and your budgets or whatever systems you've got is going to be important for developing this. And then program staff. We often exclude program staff from some of this fundraising stuff, but they have the information too about when we might need money for certain expenses, or what things are realistic. And particularly when it comes to grants, I get on my soapbox about this a lot. You know, we're not trying to write any grants that our program staff have not at least been made aware of, or at least have contributed the goals and objectives to. We can't be so siloed within our organizations where we're over here in development, you know, writing things up that the program staff are going to have to implement, and they had no say before you submitted something, and now you're in a contract and they have to deliver on those goals and objectives. I've seen that way too much. I do not like that. Making sure everyone that could possibly be impacted by this would be involved. So anybody who would have to do a certain thing or would not have the money to spend for certain things, making sure that they understand what's going on. Now, if you've got a really small team and it's just two of you, you don't have to do everything. You don't have to do online crowdfunding campaigns and 4 in-person fundraising events and submit 30 grants and, whatever else. Just pick what is going to work for you. So when you are looking at your budget for the year and understanding, okay, here's what we need, and then setting those fundraising goals, here's how much we're trying to raise, understand, okay, for some really small organizations, they just have a couple of fundraising events a year and then they're fine for the rest of the year. For those organizations, I also encourage them to, touch in with donors now and then, start getting that CRM system going, and start building towards things in the future, like getting their organization ready for applying for grants in the future. But if that's what works for you, then if that's all you need, then you don't have to overcomplicate it. So I would love, Eva, if you don't mind turning on your mic, I would love to hear what y'all are doing for, or you can type in the chat box if you're more comfortable with that, what you are doing for fundraising. And so what that information would be that you'd have to get more people involved in.
Hi, this is Eva. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Well, with our organization, we're kind of in a unique situation in that our goal is to be out of business within the next 5 years by doing the legislative changes so that we are no longer necessary. So, but in the meantime, we have to fundraise to be able to post the bonds that we do, but also we're also a bit odd in that works as a revolving fund. We post bonds for people. If they resolve their cases, the money comes back to us. Mm-hmm. So that piece is a revolving model. Ideally, the money just goes round and round and round between us and the court system and comes back. But we do need operating expenses. Mm-hmm. Our fundraising, we actually have one just kicking in right now around Mother's Day. Our primary focus in terms of getting funds is Mother's Day, Father's Day, and then around the Christmas, New Year holiday season, because it's home for the holidays. Mm-hmm. So we've got basically online. We do online funding. We use Fundly and our fiscal sponsor to promote that. We're part of a national network of bond funds. And okay. So we can piggyback on their fundraising work. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Is that, so you got 2 campaigns a year and then that revolving bond funds. Is that working for y'all?
It keeps us going. We're sustainable. I mean, we don't pay ourselves very much. It's more of a volunteer with a stipend as opposed to a salary type of situation. I'm in a very privileged situation, so it works for me. Mm-hmm. And my colleague, she's with the ACLU, so she gets a salary through them. So this work is very much volunteer based. Okay,
so you might want to increase the amount that you're able to fundraise, though.
Yes.
Okay.
If we can increase the amount of funds we have, we can pay higher bonds. We kind of cap ourselves at a lower level of bonds, so it might be good to be able to pay higher bonds.
Okay. Would y'all be able to get peer-to-peer fundraisers? So are there people that are also passionate about your cause that would fundraise with their networks on your behalf?
We do try that. I mean, we work well with a lot of public defenders, and we try and get them to use their networks to primarily law firms and other people that they know to try and support the work.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like, yes, you're already doing that, or would doing that more help?
To a lesser extent. I mean, we just don't have the resources because it's myself and one other person. So it's kind of, because the revolving model is working in terms of the money we need to post bonds, we haven't been focused enough on bigger fundraising goals.
Yeah. So what I would say is looking at your calendar, maybe for your organization, your calendar also includes other things that aren't just fundraising. Maybe it's actually like looking at your work calendar and saying, okay, my colleague only has 10 hours or however many hours a week to spend on this, and most of that time is spent doing this, but these are the weeks or the months where things are heavier. And then seeing where you can carve out a little bit of extra time to work on some other fundraising tasks, which might be meeting with one major individual donor or potential major individual donor a month. Or it might be something as simple as like, let me create a couple of graphics and a couple of social media posts to give to those people who could do that peer-to-peer fundraising for us. So you don't have to necessarily, I mean, you can look for grants, you can try other strategies as well, but what you can do is just carve out a little bit more time to give yourself more of a head start. So when it comes to that Home for the Holidays and stuff, that crowdfunding campaign, one of those best practices is having half of what you're trying to raise before you even start that campaign. So then you're more likely to raise beyond your goal because people want to contribute to a successful campaign. And so what you could do for your organization is say, okay, we're doing the holiday season and we're starting that maybe December 20th. I don't know. Let's just make it up though. We're starting that December 20th. So I need to have something secured before December 20th. I'm going to start in October and start asking a couple of the people I know, hey, will you donate $500? Hey, will you donate $1,000 to get that seed money for that larger campaign later in the year? So there's ways you can use that calendar to say, hey, if I just have a couple of hours every month, how can I really maximize that time? So
yeah,
that would be my recommendation for you. Yeah.
Yeah, just need to flag that.
Yeah.
I think having the reminders, because it's not at the front of my mind, we're just focused on getting people out of jail without, looking too far forward at this point.
Right. Well, and I think that advice really applies for all of us. Not hardly any of us are able to full time do, any particular fundraising task. So really identifying like, okay, how detailed do I need to be? Do I need to say, have one task per week that I have to complete to prep for this whatever campaign, or to prep for these grants, or to call up different funders. So really identifying how having that plan helps you really maximize your time. And it also helps you look forward, because when everything's laid out on a fundraising calendar, you're able to see, oh, here's what's coming up next month, so that you're not like, oh, this is due April 1st and today's April 1st and I haven't even started working on it. You're able to see what's coming up and be ahead of it and on top of it. Oh, yes, you're welcome. Will you go to the next slide, Nick? Thank you. So how can you involve your team? I have a lot of different ways, but I would also love to hear from y'all how you involve your teams. Some of my favorite ways to involve the team is having a planning session where, think of it like a strategic planning session or anything else where you've got like sticky notes up on the wall and like brainstorming and ideas, but it's structured enough to where people can give their input. And you can capture that, and then someone's responsible for like creating that action plan, which is the fundraising calendar, and maybe even another like brief document of here are fundraising goals or whatever. That's one way I really love to involve people in the team, because it gives a certain type of energy, especially when we have like a couple of more fun things, which I always think sticky notes are fun. Personally, I love doing sticky notes and all of my stuff. But whatever your team might think is fun, to get that energy behind those fundraising ideas, and so that people feel like, oh, I'm not just being presented a plan and can review it, I'm actually getting to give my input to the plan in the first place. You might also do that in a smaller, less in-person way of just surveys. I've done this before where it's like, send out to board members, hey, is there anyone you know that might be a good individual donor for us to cultivate? Do you have any connections with any foundations? Do you have any ideas of things we should be doing for this coming year's fundraising? And it's kind of they get a little bit less input than if they were, they are able to give less input than if they were at a planning session, but they still are able to give some input. Or you don't have to be that formal, and you can just email and ask for ideas, or set up a brief meeting and ask for ideas, or a little fundraising ideas box, however you want to do it. Ask for different opportunities or connections. Does anyone know someone at such and such foundation? Does anyone have a good brewery we can host this pint night at? Whatever your strategy is. Another way to involve your team is getting them to review it. And I would encourage you to do this even if, and maybe especially if, they have been a part of this other column of being in a planning session or surveys or ask for input or ideas, opportunities. Get them to review it and say, okay, this works, this is realistic. Here's, and then asking for support. So asking like, here's where we have some blanks. Is there anywhere that you could contribute to this? Or is there anything that you can fill in on this? And having those responsible parties column, seeing if anybody is like, you know what, I'm really excited about this event that we have coming up. Maybe I can take on a bigger role for it this year. Things like that. I also really love to communicate progress. Whether that's saying, hey, I really like to do this with my clients, but I encourage them to do it on their teams as well. Take a snapshot when a grant is submitted of like, you just submitted, and take a screenshot of that and then send it in a little email to everyone with a GIF or whatever, and just be like, oh, hey, it's submitted. Like, we'll see what happens, but at least we did our part and sent off a strong application. Or maybe, hey, we're halfway to our fundraising goal for the year. Great job, everyone. Like, let's keep up the good work. By being positive and by sharing what's working, your team is going to be more encouraged to continue. And if certain things aren't working, it's also important to communicate that progress in a way that is both honest and still, I don't want to say positive because that's putting too much pressure on it, but not negative, at least neutral, not negative. So if y'all didn't get any of the grants that you applied for so far this year, you can send that out to your team and say, we'll keep trying and we will put extra effort into our fundraising event in the fall, whatever that might be. But still trying to keep that energy positive or more neutral and not negative, and not be like, we're doing terrible, we're not going to make payroll. Like, let's not try and be extremist or catastrophic about it. And also, yes, of course, sharing successes. That's kind of like communicating progress. But even the little successes of like, hey, met with this individual donor today and it's looking promising, whatever helps. Because the more you communicate with a larger team, even if you're the only person in an organization and you're trying to get interns or volunteers, or you're trying to get board members or your steering committee involved, even just communicating that keeps fundraising at the top of everyone's mind. And if you're communicating things aren't going as well, they might have more of an opportunity to jump in, or they might have other ideas that you can put on your fundraising calendar for the end of the year, because you're adjusting things as things go and making sure that everything's working for you. So that's a lot about teams. Do we have any other questions about teams? I know this is really tough, especially for those smaller organizations who just feel like everyone is so busy or no one wants to help. And a lot of organizations, even that are bigger, it's like, well, I can't get my board to lift a finger for fundraising. Any questions? I also, while you're typing your questions, please do. I also want to ask if anyone else has involved their team members in other ways, or have examples of some of these things working, or maybe we could troubleshoot if some of these things didn't work for your organization. Okay, I'll maybe give it another minute in case someone's typing. Sometimes it can take a minute to come through. All right, well, let's go ahead. Nick, if you don't mind jumping down a couple of slides to that implementation slide. Great. And if you're typing, we'll pause and come back to you. Implementation. So there are like it's so wonderful if you create this beautiful fundraising calendar and you've got this plan for your organization and everybody was involved in creating it and we're all just really excited about it and jazzed about it. And then you do nothing with it. That's like, you know, what everyone says about their strategic plan just living on a shelf. A lot of fundraising plans just live on a shelf until 6 months into the year and we're like, oh my goodness, we do not have enough money. Oops, we were supposed to be doing all this fundraising, but we, you know, didn't make it a priority and didn't focus on it. So implementation is really like a super important part to all of this. Thinking about how you will use your fundraising calendar. You know, you've already done this in most of it, but this includes like who will have access to the calendar. Is this for your entire team? Is this something you're sharing with your board? Are you sharing just like print copies or view only copies and you're the one responsible for editing it? Can other people jump in and update their row when they submitted a certain grant application or they completed a certain campaign? Who will have access to it and how will that look like? Who will be responsible for completing the tasks on the calendar? That's why that staff responsible or persons responsible column is so important, because when people's names are on it, then, and hopefully you have had people volunteer for that, not necessarily like you went and filled it out in a dark corner of your room and then just like gave it to everybody and everyone was like, oh my goodness, I didn't know I would have to be doing this year, or why'd you put my name here? That kind of stuff. Hopefully they've had a chance to volunteer for it instead of be voluntold. But really identifying, okay, who is going to be responsible for what, keeping track of that, and then making sure they have some sort of access. It might be view only, but some sort of access to that calendar to keep on top of mind, like, oh, here's what I'm responsible for. Also, who will be responsible for updating the calendar? This is another question. If no one's responsible for updating the calendar, then the rest of those cells are not going to get filled out, honestly, seriously. And then how often will it be updated? So typically the way I like to use fundraising calendars are, you know, I like to have a weekly meeting and just say like, pull it up, and it takes like 2 seconds because each of us have filled it in our pieces during the week. And so we pull it up and we say, okay, you know, how did that thing go? Great. Did you have any questions? Are there any challenges or barriers to you completing this on time? You know, what support do you need? How can we help you if there's something you need help with? What questions came up? And then looking ahead and saying, okay, what's due next month? What can we get started on? How can we really make sure that we are prepared for everything and don't submit anything last minute? So I like looking at it weekly. If that doesn't work for your team, then that doesn't work for your team. But making sure you and your team have an understanding of here's who's responsible for what, here's who's going to actually update the calendar, here's how often we're going to look at it together, and here's how often like the persons responsible for it are going to update it. We have a question now, I think. So what restrictions do we have with fundraising? Can we sell products and not pay taxes? What do you recommend on how to allocate extra funds over the fundraiser goals? Okay, lots of great questions. What restrictions do you have with fundraising? Can you sell products and not pay taxes? I don't know. Honestly, I have no idea. I know you can do, it's like business related income nonprofits can have, but I don't know if that's particularly tax exempt, especially when it comes to sales tax and things. That's something I would probably just have to Google. Sorry, I don't know that. We can unrelated business income with the IRS. Yes, thank you, Keisha. That's what it's called. Look that up and that'll give you all the information you need to know. So unrelated business income is what I believe that stands for. What do you recommend on how to allocate extra funds over the fundraiser goals? So if you raise more money than you anticipated, that's great. When it comes to a specific fundraising event or individual donors, and you raise money well over what you were hoping to raise, you can use that unrestricted. You can use that however your organization wants to. If that means you want to increase staff salaries and give everybody a bump, that's something I strongly encourage a lot of nonprofits to do, is to give salary raises. related business income tax. Okay, either way, I'm sure if you Google it, that'll work. Thank you, Keisha. So if it's from individuals, maybe you save that up. Maybe that's part of your reserves. If your organization doesn't have a reserves, I strongly encourage you to get your board to put a reserves policy in place. That's another thing. I would just Google reserves policy. Typically, it's somewhere between 3 to 6 months, maybe more, of cash in the bank, reserved in case something like, I don't know, COVID-19 happens and you have to cancel your fundraising event or something like that. So if you don't have a reserves policy, that's what I would recommend. If you don't have a reserves and you raise more, I would start putting some of that money into reserves for sure. But if it's a grant, that's a different story. If you ask for $75,000 in grants and you really only needed 35, but you were just really trying to make sure that you were going to get enough, because those grants have specific contracts a lot of times. If it's general operating, you're totally fine. If it's program or project and it's restricted, then what you will have to do is talk to those funders and say, whichever ones you have the better relationship with, and say, hey, we are just so thankful for all of the community support for this particular program. We were wondering if we could shift our, the grant that we got from y'all to this other program, or if we could push that funding out till next year, not spend it till next year. Whatever works for your organization, whatever you actually need, I would be upfront and honest with those funders and say, hey, this restricted funding, we had an overwhelmingly positive response, and now we just want to make sure we are honoring the contracts we are setting up with our grantors. Is there another way we could potentially use this funding? So, and I've had funders who are like, yeah, for sure, totally. We're just happy for your organization. We would have supported whatever, and others that are a little bit more wary of it. But if it's restricted, you have to be really careful on how you allocate those extra funds. If it's unrestricted or from individual donors and they didn't say, I specifically want it for this or that, you're fine. You're totally fine. Any other questions? Let me see. I think that's all of our slides. Yeah, you can go to the last slide, Nick. We're good. So again, I can put that link one more time in the chat to that fundraising calendar template. It's just a template, a place for you to start. I really want to make sure your organization is focused on what is going to work for you and what y'all actually need. So make sure you change the columns and change it around to have it work for your organization. But we have another question. Have you seen a success story utilizing this fundraising calendar? I'd be curious to hear what roadblocks / challenges they encountered along the way and how they overcame them. Yes, great question, Josh. I use this fundraising calendar with all of my clients and set them up to use it on their own after we're done with our contract, because I'm a social worker, so I'm trying to work myself out of a job, like many of your organizations are trying to actually solve the issue that you're addressing. And so I would say the organizations that I've seen it use successfully have been able to identify, hey, we're actually not asking for that. We're not actually asking that many times a year. So some organizations save their ask for just one time a year, and they realize, oh, we could actually spread this out over the year a little bit more. Or they say, hey, we're actually not asking for that much grant funding. And they identify, here are the months where we don't have any fundraising happening, and they plug in some new things. I've seen that be a really successful way to use this fundraising calendar, is to say, where could we potentially be doing more? I've also seen organizations use this fundraising calendar to anticipate their cash flows, and they've changed when they have their major fundraising events to a different time in the year, because they aren't going to have as much cash flow, or they aren't going to have the cash they need in the bank. So if you're really looking at it like a map and saying what's going to work for us, then it's going to be more successful. Now, the roadblocks and challenges that I've seen are no one being responsible for it. So it's just like, oh, we all made this, but then no one's really updating it. We're not really talking about it. Like, we're all just assuming everyone else is doing their job without actually checking in and saying, hey, how's that going? How can I support you? That is one of the major roadblocks I've seen, is people not incorporating this into their regular meetings, or even having regular meetings with their team about the different fundraising activities. And how they've overcome that is just by incorporating that into their regular meetings. I've also seen some organizations go a little bit wild with how much information they're trying to track on this spreadsheet, because I mean, it's just an Excel spreadsheet or a Google spreadsheet, you know. So I've seen them try to put like 20 extra columns in this, and then they kind of set themselves up for failure, because it's just not realistic to be tracking every single tiny detail of everything in this fundraising calendar. So what I would encourage you to do is really keep it realistic for your organization and say, here's the information we need. We can always add more or take out more later, but like, we are committed to filling in these columns for every single opportunity, so that when we have a sum at the bottom for the amount requested, for example, that works, and we know how much money we have requested. And when we have a sum at the bottom of the amount raised, we have an accurate picture of whatever we're tracking. So that's a great question, Josh. I hope that answers it. Any other questions? As people might be typing questions, I just want